All right, in this video, we're going to talk about different legal structures or legal formation or entities. Those are all terms that you may hear or read about on the internet when it comes to setting up your real estate business. Now, before we begin, I want to just make a little bit of a disclaimer that this is not legal advice. Rather, this is information to help you start a discussion with a legal representative or an attorney in your state to sort of figure out which option or legal structure is best for you. Now, there's two most basic business entity or legal structures that we tend to see for real estate agents, and that is a sole proprietor or a limited liability company, also known as a LLC. There could be more than that. You could have partnerships and different legal structures like that or corporations, but for a majority of real estate agents, they're not going to, and it's not going to be advantageous to set up those legal structures. You may want a partnership if you are establishing, for example, a team with another high performing real estate agent, for an example. That might be something you want to explore or discuss. But for a majority of real estate agents, they're going to either be a sole proprietor or look into setting up a limited liability company. And we're just going to kind of talk about the reason and pros and cons of each of them. And a lot of times it has to do with either legal protection from a liability perspective, hence the name limited liability, or from a tax perspective with an ability to save some taxes by setting up a limited liability company. Now, as a sole proprietor, this is kind of how it works, and this is generally the reason people may look at setting up an LLC because, as a sole proprietor, let's say your real estate agent, John Smith, if you were to get sued, and let's be real and let's be honest, as a real estate agent, we are in a position where we can find ourselves on the end of a lawsuit just because we're dealing with such a large financial purchase and money, and there are a lot of law and legal issues and rules that we as real estate agents have to follow when it comes to our fiduciary responsibilities and disclosure requirements and those sorts of things. And so, let's say you have an unsatisfied client, Mr. and Mrs. Seller. If they're unhappy, they felt like you have a breach of contract or misrepresentation, they feel like you lied, any of those sorts of things that could have been pertinent to their decision for selling or buying a home, for example, they may go ahead and try to sue you as the real estate agent, which would put your personal assets at risk. And so, if you have a lot of personal assets, maybe you have a large bank account or a home, those sorts of things, you could open yourself up to some liability and you may have to pay or compensate your monetary damages with your personal assets. And but the thing is that often that occurs that we want to mention is that a lot of times lawsuits are actually aimed at the brokerage because at the end of the day you work for and the contract is actually through the brokerage and you simply represent the broker, and the broker a lot of times is responsible and at fault or and required to supervise all activities done by a real estate agent. So this offers some level of protection. Now, again, every situation is unique, and this shouldn't be taken as that a sole proprietor is going to offer you all the protection you need from a legal or a liability standpoint. Just be aware that, like, compared to other stuff, because if you're reading about other businesses or self employed, often people will always recommend that you set up an LLC, which I would definitely agree with in terms of that because there's no other protection. Let's say if you're going back to this example that you're John Smith Landscaping and Mr. and Mrs. Seller are suing you because you damaged their property while you're doing landscaping, then yeah, you're definitely going to want to set up a different LLC structure to offer some protection from liability if you get sued. And but again, like I said, with your real estate broker, there's this level of pseudo protection, I should say. It's not real protection, but pseudo protection because you could still be at fault and you could still get sued personally. So it doesn't offer full protection, but examples include like errors and omission insurance. That's why you have that liability as well for some insurance for some liability protection. And this is kind of a demonstrated reason why people set up limited liability companies or LLCs, is because if Mr. and Mrs. Seller decide to sue, they actually sue the real estate LLC. And the only thing at risk, potentially, if you followed everything correctly, is the LLC assets. But in order to maintain this level of protection between your personal assets and your LLC assets, you need to ensure that you're maintaining a corporate veil that we often refer to. And one of the things that can kind of tear back that corporate veil, that's the word that a lot of times attorneys will use, is by commingling your funds, or in other words, putting your personal money with your business money, and your business money or your real estate career money with your personal money. Because then at that point, it's not really like you're treating your entity as a separate entity, and instead it looks very much like it is a part of you. So it is possible to kind of eliminate any of the advantages of an LLC. So if you are considering setting up an LLC and becoming an entity structure, for the purpose of liability protection, you need to make sure that you're also following the rules that are required in order to maintain that sort of that protection that's available. A sole proprietor is the legal entity that most real estate agents operate as. Whether or not it's sufficient for you, or whether or not you should set yourself up as a sole proprietor, is something to discuss with a local real estate attorney. It's usually the simplest to set up because it doesn't really require you to do anything. And the two biggest reasons that people set up, or some of the reasons people set up a LLC or a limited liability company, is because they want some of that liability protection from maybe if they're hiring employees and those sorts of things, that it's going to offer some of that legal protection in the event of any lawsuits from either employees or clients or other real estate agents. And the other thing is that some real estate agents may wish to take advantage of some of the tax benefits that are available to a limited liability company, but these are usually only available to real estate agents that have a sufficient income level, because it's going to require you to ensure that you can pay yourself a market wage, and you still have a profit left over that is sufficient to cover the additional expenses that you're going to incur when it comes from, the bookkeeping side and tax accounting side perspective. So very few real estate agents are going to be able to benefit from setting up an LLC for the purposes of saving money on taxes. So what do you need to do if you decide that you want to set up as a sole proprietor? It's just your default status. You don't really need to do anything. Nothing is needed. And if you're a sole proprietor, you can go ahead and set up that business or personal bank account and operate as your sole proprietor. To set up a limited liability company, you need to file the equivalent articles of organization in your state, and that process looks different and varies for each state that you're in, and it can be a simple process or it can be a kind of a complex process depending on if you know what you're doing. To file it, we recommend that you talk with a local attorney or read some articles on the internet about the process. There are some great quick online services that can help you, Rocket Lawyer, those types of things, places that you can set up a simple filing service, and prices can vary from $100 to $500, or even a little bit cheaper depending on what method that you're going with. In the next video, we're going to talk a little bit more about your tax classification status, which is a little bit different than your legal entity or legal structure.